Hey guys, so I wanted to speak today a little bit about a subject that I don't think I've spoken before about, which is the dark night of the soul. Before I get into that, please remember that if you get something from this talk, please like the video, and if any questions come up, please leave them in the comments below. And then finally, if you like this kind of content, please subscribe to the channel. Doing any or all of those things helps me out big time. And if you'd like to help support me financially during these really tough times for yoga teachers, you can subscribe to my Patreon page. All right, so the dark night of the soul, what is it? It could be thought of as depression. A very popular author today is Eckhart Tolle. And if you read his book and his story, if you understand about his story, he went through years and years, decades really, of deep depression before he had his spiritual awakening. He did not do any kind of spiritual practices. He was not a particularly spiritual, quote-unquote, spiritual person. But it was his deep depression that eventually led him to his realization of truth. This is also true of another teacher that I really like named Byron Katie. So Byron Katie, similar story. She had very, very deep clinical depression. She apparently was a very unpleasant person to be around. People were very scared of her. And then she checked herself into a halfway house, and then one day had a great realization, checked herself out, and then from that day forward, she was teaching spirituality, what she likes to call the work. So we see here that this deep depression can lead to a very deep spiritual realization. And the opposite may also be said to be true, that if we embark on our spiritual path, we will likely bump up against the dark corners of our own psyche. And these dark corners are dark because they contain things that we don't really want to experience or look at. And so we hide them from ourselves. And we hide them in all sorts of ways. We hide them by working too much. We hide them by constantly being busy, by binge watching television shows, by gossiping, by drinking and doing drugs, even sometimes by pursuing certain spiritual paths. We can actually mask or block these dark corners of our own psyche, what Carl Jung might have called the shadow side. So if our yoga is working, if our spirituality is working, it begins to dig these things up, and we begin to become more and more aware of these dark corners. And that's a good thing ultimately, but it isn't always pleasant to experience it. And at a certain stage, we begin to realize that if we feel bad, it really isn't because of anything that's happening in our lives. You might say the unawakened view is to ascribe any sense of depression or feeling badly to circumstances and people. Same with happiness. Oh, I feel good. It's because of you. It's because of this. It's because of that. The spiritual perspective is different. Joy and happiness are really uncaused, and they are eternal. And this is also true of our dark corners, these things that we don't want to see. These are not necessarily caused by the situation that we find ourselves in. Rather, the particular situation we find ourselves in is simply maybe triggering that feeling. Now, those feelings can be triggered by situations, people, places, events, but they can also be triggered by our practices. And in fact, they are supposed to be triggered by our practices. So if our yoga is working, if there are any dark corners, eventually we will find it. And it's important that when we do find it, that we understand that it is natural, it is normal, and it is part of the process. Okay? So in the talk that I gave the other week about happiness and happiness always being with you, this is true. And I'm doing this talk now because I am personally dealing with what might be called a dark night. I'm going through a very deep, dark, emotional place right now. I feel very raw, very tender. I sort of just want to roll up in a ball and hide myself. Now, because of my work, spiritual work that I've done over my life, I'm not going to do that. I know that I have the strength to get through this, that this too shall pass. But I thought it important to share that because I do talk a lot about happiness and joy as being a part of this journey, and they for sure are. But there is also this dark side, you might say, the yin to the yang of all that happiness. So it's important that we're aware of both. All right, I hope that you found that helpful, and if you did, once again, please give me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and leave questions below. I'd love to know if you have ever had to deal with depression, or what, again, in spirituality we might call a dark night of the soul. And if you have, I'd love it if you would share it in the comments below. All right, yogins, thanks so much for listening. Namaste.